The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the sponsors, advertisers, or presenters. Advertising does not imply endorsement by the sponsors and presenters.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Lighting Controls Podcast. I'm your host, Webster Marsh. My co-host, Ron Kuzma, is out today, so it's just going to be me. But we've got an excellent guest for you to listen to today. Hopefully you enjoy it. But before we get into it, just want to let you know that this is presented by the Lighting Controls Association, or the LCA, and financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, or NAILD. And again, I'm going to keep reminding you, if you haven't checked out our website, check it out. We've got some great content for you, all of our episodes, news feeds, and a merch store if you want to buy some merch and support the podcast. But thank you so much for joining us, and now into it. So today we've got a special guest, Anthony Guerriero. Anthony, do you mind just giving us a quick breakdown on who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, let me say thank you for having me. As you mentioned, my name is Anthony Guerriero. I work with Boston Light Source. I've been in the lighting industry for about 10 years now. It was my first job out of college. I went to school for electronic engineering. Wentworth, go Leopards. I've been with BLS for 10 years, fell into the job. I feel like everybody probably falls into the lighting industry, right? Doesn't really know it's a thing. But I've been there ever since, and Boston Light Source makes it easy to stay. So,
well, awesome. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining us. I mean, it's a mutual appreciation for having you on here. And I think, you've been in the industry for a while now, that you've seen a lot of changes over the years. But like you said, this is kind of the job you've been in, and as what you do with Boston Light Source, you're a sales rep. But you're also, you focus on controls as well. So you kind of double dip into the luminaires and the controls side of things. And so I was just curious if you wouldn't mind just sharing what that experience is like.
yeah, absolutely. So I started out doing applications and just running calculations for our spec sales team, and it kind of evolved from there. I ended up working in the post sales part for our controls department, and ended up kind of troubleshooting controls. And I think that's actually where we kind of came across each other,
Yes.
helping out on a couple of projects. But it was one of those scenarios where we had a gap to fill, and when I transitioned into that role, it just kind of worked out. But being able to see the industry from a lighting and a control standpoint, I think, is a huge benefit for myself, particularly being a spec rep, just because of the fact that it gives me the allowance to the capability to talk to both an engineer and an architect and an interior designer and a lighting designer when needed, on different levels than most spec reps I've run into. So it's definitely, it's multifaceted.
No, totally. And so I think, to your point, it allows you to kind of bring in those conversations as you need. So, if it's specifically controls, you can shelve the lighting for the moment, but you can bring it in if need be. But I'm just curious, the term spec rep, I don't know if many of our listeners will be familiar with that term. And so would you mind giving us a quick definition of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So specification sales rep, we represent a specific number of manufacturers. We're contractually obligated to however many manufacturers that they might be in your territory, but we specifically are their sales team for a set territory. So we work with electrical distributors, we work with electrical contractors, we work with general contractors, architects, engineers, lighting designers, and we run the gamut. So wherever we're needed on a project, we fit in, but typically we're focused on driving a specification with different architects, lighting designers, and engineers, and making sure that everything gets through appropriately.
Right. So your role is to support the documentation of, a light fixture, so that if a specifier is designing with that, you can really facilitate the use of that. And so similarly, in the controls side of things, what would you say is your role within the team?
So on the control side, I mean, from a design team standpoint, right? Is that what you're thinking right there?
Yeah. I mean, because one of the questions Ron and I like to throw at people, and maybe a good starting point here as well, is who do you think owns the lighting controls scope? Who should be the one responsible wearing the lighting controls designer hat?
such a muddy little territory that to get into there, and we've kind of had this chat before, but it's one of
Yeah.
those scenarios where lighting controls are evolving so much every single day, and everybody kind of thinks, oh well, all the lighting controls do the same thing. It's just different widgets to do those different things, and there's really a boundary, and you kind of have to know your control system and be able to work with an engineer that is taking responsibility most of the time. It's usually an electrical engineer.
Right.
I do see lighting designers taking more of a share in that responsibility nowadays, and definitely working hand in hand with a lot of designers in our territory, specifically to kind of create a whole narrative before the engineer even gets the electrical drawings. But it does get to a point where that line in the sand has to be drawn. Who's going to take the responsibility for zoning? Who's going to take the responsibility for programming? I think like a lighting designer typically has a more of a pull in that scenario to make sure that the project is doing exactly what they designed the lighting for. But I think the engineer needs to be able to say, listen, this is code compliant, this isn't code compliant, or this is code compliant, and make sure that they understand what's going on in the space as well. So it's tough to kind of delineate, and we're seeing more of a mix nowadays. So
Hmm. And just curious why you're seeing an increase in that. Is it just that the industry is slowly catching up, or is it that there's something motivating that?
it's this little thing called the IECC 2021 for sure in our market at least, driving a lot of the conversations that we're having. We also, being in the Boston market, we do have to worry about stretch code in some certain townships and cities. So it's something that's evolving every single day. So I think the conversation around it is evolving because of that. And lighting designers definitely have more of a say in the specification of a control system. At least they should,
Sure.
in most scenarios. So yeah, it's definitely ICC 2021. Code is picking up, and I think ash rate just changed around the country, if I'm not
Hmm.
mistaken. So that just upped everybody's game. Everybody was behind on IECC 2015 and stuff like that. So, but we've been designing to 2021 since it came out.
Right. And so, I mean, I guess the argument to be made here is that energy code is still the motivator for basically any real innovation or change within our industry.
Yeah,
And I guess I'm curious what your thoughts are regarding that. Do you think that's a good thing, a bad thing, a neutral thing?
I'm pretty neutral about it. So I've given a bunch of IECC 2021 presentations to electrical engineers, and every time I give the presentation and we get to the plug load control portion, they look at me like I'm the bad guy, like I'm the one that wrote it that says you have to buy more stuff for this project. And
Right.
that's kind of one of those situations where you kind of just have to be like, listen, we can provide a solution that's going to be more cost effective and still, give you IECC 2021 compatibility. But yeah, it's definitely code that drives innovation, especially in the controls sector.
Hmm.
But from that same standpoint, from an innovation standpoint, being able to tie in lighting and controls in the same platform and really have a smooth handshake between those two things is super important as far as the
Sure.
innovation goes.
Well, and so I guess, do you see innovation in that specific vein that lighting and controls integration is still a challenge that needs to be fixed, or are we getting to a plateau?
I think we're getting to kind of I think it definitely needs to be. Uh, I think we have a way to go before we hit a plateau there as far as integration goes. Just because of the fact that it's not everybody does it the same way. There's certain people like and correct me if I can't name drop, but Acuity Brands is definitely leading the way as far as innovation in that section goes because of the fact that
Mhm.
we can put controls into almost every single one of our fixtures and tie it together with a control system that's out there with millions of square feet of installed base. So I think there's a ways to go before it plateaus, but I think the innovation is going to come beforehand.
Sure. And so what do you think we still are missing as it pertains to lighting controls? Is there something that you can point to and say we need to be better about that?
I mean, looking at it from a holistic standpoint, I couldn't pinpoint one thing that would be missing from a lighting control spec that we've written over the past few months,
Sure.
just because it has to be in there. I guess, if anything, something on a commercial level that lets it be a little bit more personal for
Mhm.
occupants is definitely something that could be considered. But then you get into that space where is the architect going to like that, or if that fixture over there is dimmed to 20% and everything else is at 40 or 50, it's going to look weird from that perspective. So it's going to take away from what an architect or a lighting designer had in mind for the project. But
Sure.
I don't know. Is there something that you think is missing?
Well, I think you hit on what I think is missing, and I just wanted to point out that from what you're saying, I agree that intent, identifying intent is really critical. And to your point, you can innovate all you want, but is the architect going to want it? Is the owner going to want it? And so we need to do a better job of identifying and clarifying expectations and deliverables in our field, because right now it's kind of anyone's guess, and sometimes you don't get the input you need to be able to make those decisions. And sometimes designers don't even have a seat at the table with the right people to ask those questions. So I think it's not so much product that we're missing. I think we've got plenty of product, and maybe, yeah, okay, we need a fine-tune product and make it work better than it does right now. But overall, we've got the features, the capabilities in the system. It's more of clarifying who wants the thing and why. And we're really bad at that right now, in my opinion. But I think we're all acknowledging that we're bad at it, which is good.
Yeah, no, I mean, whenever I do, so I don't typically get to deal with end users or work with end users or interface with them, but when I do, it's really great to hear the feedback that they provide, whether it's negative or positive. And in that same instance, right, I was just on a call the other day, and um, uh, this guy who owns multiple facilities, he was pretty upset because he has to call in an electrician just to change out what he deems as a bulb, right? And
Hmm.
it's not necessarily a bulb in this instance anymore. And he was talking about how his control system, when if there's a power outage or something like that, somebody has to come in and actually reprogram the system. Which, to me, that was a shock to hear, because I don't know of
Yeah,
any systems that operate like that. And if it is, there's a problem there. And so
right.
that's kind of how I prefaced it to him, and I asked him for more info on it, but he never got it over to me. But
Sure.
keeping that in mind, and so I'm working with the design team that's behind him, and just keeping that in mind while we're working together, and helping make sure that he doesn't have to deal with any pain points, or make sure that the pain points are kind of built in to be alleviated from that standpoint. And
Mhm.
uh, for us, we've taken a lot of the responsibility on as far as programming and as far as that handover goes to an end user. So for us, it's somebody from the Boston Light Source team that's actually going in and doing the programming on our project. So when they're local, of course, if they're out of our territory, it's not. But in this scenario where it's us going in, we have control over what's said, what's communicated. We have a point person who cares about the project. We have a point person inside who can communicate whatever might need to be communicated through the channel. So it's definitely a pain point. That's a great point that you
Right.
brought up. Yeah.
Well, but also to your point, I mean, that's kind of the ad service of sales reps, of specification reps, is that you can help carry over what the designers want and ensure that the contractors are providing that. I think the risk of being a specifier is that you send your specs out to bid, and who knows what happens during bid negotiations. Sometimes you're brought in and you can talk to the contractors and find out what they're providing. But a lot of the time, it's kind of you just cross your fingers and hope that you covered everything you need. Whereas the sales rep can at least step in and say, "Hold on a second," and have that conversation. I mean, it's not a full integrator. You're not going to be able to change anything, but at the same time, you can at least clarify what intent is. And so, if you have a clear intent and you've worked with your sales rep, they should be able to be that assistance during the bidding and construction phase that you wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, it's one of those scenarios where not every sales rep that, people, I don't know where the viewership is for this, but not everybody is going to have somebody that can go out there for their rep agency, and
Right.
it's a big thing that we can do that, but because we're a larger territory, we're able to invest in people to do that. So it's definitely an advantage. But yeah, and
Well,
if
and
something's going through the bid process and it doesn't match up with what we've discussed, or if somebody's looking for something that the end user explicitly said, I don't want that, it's definitely something we can raise a red flag and say, hey, let's recollect here and get back on the same page.
right. And so, the other thing is, as far as rep sizes go, you're seeing fewer and fewer small rep agencies nowadays. You're seeing more big rep agencies, and you're seeing a lot more agencies with a controls team that is inside of that agency focused on the controls specifications and design. And so it seems to be pretty consistent now that reps kind of take on that labor. Would you agree with
I don't
that?
think we, yeah, I don't think we really have a choice. A lot of the times it just gets pushed back too. So, when we quote something, and it's, if something goes wrong, everybody's looking at us, and
Right.
how you react kind of sets your tone for the project and for the market, really.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So, and I think that that's a really good point too, because I'm sure there are groups out there that would push back and say, well, this isn't our responsibility, especially if they
right.
don't have a controls team that they have under their roof. So as a result, then it becomes a finger pointing game, in my opinion.
It does, and that's the least fun game to play ever. And because it's from our perspective, from a rep's perspective, pointing at the design team is a no-no. It's a big no-no, right? Like there's no reason for me to point back at the designer and say, hey, I know we talked about this, or maybe even when we didn't talk about it, there's no reason for me to go back to them and say, you messed up here. And maybe we can have that conversation person to person, but I would never, it's one of those scenarios where it's like, is it actually on us, or should we just
Yeah.
help fix it as much as we can? So it's
Right. And so
definitely
so
challenging from that
that's
perspective.
well, it's challenging, but at the same time, I would say that it's the right move because it is your
It
product.
is.
You're representing that product, and
Yeah.
as a result, you need to stand behind it, even if, okay, yeah, that's on us. We should have known that, or that's on you, but we're still gonna make it right.
We're still making it right. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
it, when it is product, it's easy, right? Because troubleshooting product issues is one thing, and we fix it, that just disappears right away. But when it's something a little bit more complex, and when there's a communication error that happened, that's a bigger situation.
Right. And so, just curious if you would be willing to share any experiences where there were communication issues.
Uh, so I haven't really had a ton. There was one recently where I had actually taken a first step. I kind of was the guinea pig, and I've
Mhm.
told myself before, I've done that before, and it's worked out perfectly. But I was the guinea pig in this scenario, and I was kind of doing something that wasn't really uh, being done anywhere else. And I worked with an engineer and a lighting designer, and the lighting designer said, I don't want any wires in the
Mhm.
space. There's this really nice ceiling. We don't want it cluttered with wires and everything like that. So in working with the engineer, they wanted it to operate a specific way. We had to meet IECC 2021. So what I came up with was to use a battery powered sensor and
Mhm.
to control a wired relay panel with that sensor. So I went to Acuity and I said, guys, I know this isn't the typical way to do this, and this is how it went. And it did work off the bat, and it was kind of shaky for a little bit, but Acuity threw all the weight of Acuity behind it, and there was at one point there was like a bunch of engineers on site doing actual software, firmware, hardware updates, and we got it working. And it's definitely one of those situations where the communication was a breakdown on my end, but it was on my end. It wasn't on anybody else's end besides mine. But one thing that I did notice after that was that there was Cat 6 running through the conference ceiling, so could have been avoided.
that hurts.
Yeah, that one hurt a little bit. Being on site and seeing, playing with the battery powered sensor and looking at Cat 6 running alongside it, it was definitely not the best feeling in the world, but we made it.
No, but again, to your credit there, you found a solution that solved the problem that was being brought to you. And I think that in a lot of cases, that is sort of what makes or breaks a lighting controls system, is how dynamic it is and how adaptable it is. Because you can prepare for best case scenario all day long. Best case scenario is like maybe 10% of all projects.
Mm-hmm.
The rest of the projects that are out there, you're dealing with something that has either been miscommunicated or poorly installed or just not thought through, and so there's a major scope gap. And so I think, like you said, the company that you represented put all of their weight behind that decision and really made sure that it was going to be effective. Whereas there are other manufacturers out there that would just basically be like, well, it's not our problem. You didn't ask for it. You didn't say it. And they would leave you out to dry, essentially. And so I think ultimately that's a good thing to pay attention to if you're a lighting controls designer, is how the manufacturer treats its reps and its projects. Because that's ultimately what you're specifying in the end. I mean, yeah, aux sensor is an aux sensor, but if the aux sensor is not going to work, what is the manufacturer going to do?
Yeah. And, being able to have the confidence and say, this is, instead of changing, there was plenty of times where we talked about maybe changing the route and using a wired product and, paying the labor that would happen on that side and making sure that it was working for the end user. But we ended up sticking through it and finding the solution, like you mentioned. So it's, I'm just glad there was no plug load control in the open office areas.
But yeah, I mean, that's not free. That labor rate there is not free labor in its own sake. You have to think through it. You have to spend time working on the fix. And so, that is something that is sort of like a hidden fact about lighting controls, is the fact that, okay, the rep might have assisted with the design. That labor is not free. That labor is rolled into the cost of the project. That's why you're paying a premium price for the lighting control system. It's because you're getting the support. You can
still
go
a great
Amazon.
Price.
Yeah.
So speaking of going to Amazon, my favorite is when like an electrical contractor or an end user themselves goes and finds something on Amazon or eBay from one of our manufacturers and says, I can get it for this much. I'm like, you can't though. That's not how much it costs. And if it costs that much, there's probably a reason. It's probably on a job site. It's probably dusty. It's probably from somebody trying to make a couple extra bucks on the side. And, but then there's the other side of it too, where you see stuff that's on Amazon for, $400, and it's just that's not how much it costs. And I think that kind of skews things too.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess from that perspective, there is sort of a false impression of what things cost. And so that brings up a really good question that, as a rep myself, I get asked a lot, which is, how do you price it? How do you budget a project? Because a lot of groups will say you can't do cost per square foot. You used to be able to, because it was relay panels, switches, and sensors, and that was it. But nowadays, there's a lot more stuff that goes into a lighting control system, the more complex it becomes. And so I'm curious if you have like a recommendation for people on how to budget things.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely comes into play, and we get asked for square foot budgets all the time, and it's dangerous, quite honestly, because you don't know what you don't know. And when you have a design that's at SD, which is where we're getting requests for quotes at SD almost every single day, and there's literally nothing on the drawing. So how do you give a square foot budget for that when you can take pot shots and say it's going to be $3 a square foot for the controls, and it's going to be 18 a square foot for the lighting, just a couple arbitrary numbers. But it's one of those scenarios where if somebody remembers that at the end of the project, and it isn't that, right? When you don't want that to be the case either.
Right.
But I think with IECC 2021, the plug load control is the biggest piece of it that's getting added in, and we don't really have a great way to per square foot that. I think that's adding in some complication because of the fact that you have to account for 25% of the furniture that's not shown on furniture plans, and it's your T-mountable furniture. How do you account for that? Right. What is the 25%? Is it going to be a quad outlet? Is it going to be a dual outlet? It's nuts. So I definitely think it's getting tougher, but in a specific situation, if we can like bring to the table what a value could potentially be for that, I think it's just important to note that it could be different at the end of the project, right? And I mean, I'm not typically being asked that by the engineering community, though. That's typically from a contractor or from a GC or from an end user. So
interesting. So from the design side of things, you're not being asked for that.
Not all the time, no, because most of the time people understand that there's going to be a cost, and I can kind of, it depends on where in the project it is too, right? So if if the project is kind of designed and we know what we're doing and there might be a few more changes, I can kind of give them that line item and say, hey, look, this is what you should be expected to pay, and mark it up, account for markup through the channels, and make sure that everybody's getting their piece of it. But so that's something that we typically do with the design team, but the design team's not like asking me for the square foot budgets anymore.
Sure. Yeah. So, well, it sounds like at the very least, they're getting more savvy to the fact that you can't per square foot a lighting control system anymore. I would say that it's still, I would make the argument that it's still probably a prevalent misconception that you can do a square foot cost.
Somebody's doing a per square foot somewhere, and that's why VE happens when you're in DDs.
Right. Right, exactly. So it's like, well, why are we paying $10 per square foot for this lighting control system? It's like, because somebody overestimated what you thought you needed.
Yeah.
But
just to backtrack, I think that ties into what we were talking about. What's missing is in the communication, right? And I think sometimes it's the communication that doesn't even occur that gets miscommunicated. And it's from that standpoint where, somebody's looking at a drawing, and no offense here to any estimators that might watch, but sometimes people are looking at a drawing and they might take a complete pot shot at what stuff costs, or they go to eBay, they go to Amazon, and they see what stuff is, and that ends up kind of causing some trouble. So if there are estimators watching, please talk to your reps.
I think that's just great recommendation for anybody, whether they're a professional estimator or they're just somebody who gets asked, okay, how much is this going to cost me? But at the same time, I think the better choice here for budgeting a project is to try to not budget it in SD, which is unfortunate because you kind of need to have an idea of cost at the SD level. So, what is the best way of approaching that?
I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it's partnering with somebody, and whoever you're working with, be it a rep, be it an electrical contractor, have them leverage their relationships. If you don't have one as a designer, have distributors. Distributors can do some takeoffs. We work with distributors that can go into our control software and do a layout. So it's one of those things where the right person has to be involved in order to give you a good budget. But one thing that I can say is that there's some innovation coming from that standpoint, where an electrical contractor could potentially pull up a submittal and see what stuff's potentially going to cost, or put together a simple room and see what stuff's going to cost. So, and actually be able to put the PO through an app, which would kind of be cool, but it would have to go through us anyways. As a rep, I want it to come through the channels anyways, just to make sure that everything's kosher. But yeah, there's a few different ways to do it, but most of it involves communication, like we talked about.
Sure. No, totally. And so yeah, I think this kind of fits into a lot of conversations that Ron and I have had in the past with other people, either sales or integrators, is basically get us involved early. Don't keep the smoke screen up for too long, because as a result, you're just going to be making it worse when we do get involved, because now we're going to have to backtrack some things that you've said, or fill in some gaps that you've left open. So in that position, I mean, getting somebody who knows the capabilities of the system early on in the project design is probably one of the easiest things to get accurate information and good specs.
Yeah, I mean, from that aspect too, knowing what your budget is when you start a project, there's so many times where we're in SDs and we're working with designers, and the big question comes up, and what is the budget that we need to hit? And they just say there is a budget. We don't know what it is. So it's one of the hardest things because of that fact. It's a situation where you don't want to go over, but you don't want to under design the project for the end user anyways. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's also the fear that if you underestimate, you lose any potential to grow that budget.
Yeah, it's usually going to be high.
Yeah.
So as because of the fact, easier to take out than it is to put in later.
Right. So as a result, it's really helpful to have somebody with pricing structures and is able to help guide. But without that target, it's you may end up in a situation where you gave a $300,000 estimate for a $30,000 budget, and then it's like, oh, I didn't realize we were going for bottom bargain bin situation here. But so it's not fun when that happens. When that does come up, if we design to, let's say $15 a square foot, all in lighting and controls, that's a pretty tight budget, right? That's not from your design days. That's like pretty mid tier, right? But it's common. It's definitely not uncommon. But if we do that and then somebody budgets for $8 a square foot, that's a bad situation. So totally no, and I think that's the other trick there is identifying tiering, because a lot of lighting controls manufacturers, Acuity included, have different models that they structure around. So it may be that you need just like the most industrial low powered option so that you can just switch your warehouse lighting on and off. Or you need, super complex DMX controls for this insane multimedia experience. And those have wildly different pricing structures as well. And
different architecture too, from a control standpoint. Completely different architecture.
Right. And so I guess that's a good word that I'm hearing more and more people in our industry use, which I'm curious, because I think some people are using it in a different way. But do you mind just giving a quick definition of what lighting controls architecture is?
Yeah. So that would be the structure of how a system's put together, whether it be based on, I mean, it's a pretty wide ranging, right? And from a controls nerd perspective, there's a wide range of things that it can be. So, I mean, you have to take into account when you're thinking about that. What's the size of the closet where things are going? You got to take into account protocol, DMX, like you mentioned, and you might need something larger for a DMX situation that's going to be multimedia, and that if it's a facade for a building, you're going to need a pretty solid area to put your controls in. But so mostly focusing on what the structure of the system looks like, whether it's daisy chain, star topology, if it's dolly, anything that includes putting together the actual system.
Right. So basically the nuts and bolts. So if we're talking about oh, absolutely. I mean, if you're talking about like a super simple lighting controls solution where you just have a switch and a power pack and an occupancy sensor, the architecture is to switch the power pack and the occupancy sensor with Cat5 running between everything. Whereas a more complex DMX, you might have an equipment rack in an electrical room that's connected to a network switch that's connected to the building network. That's, it just it snowballs. And so
Yep.
as a result, it's no longer, with the simple solution, yeah, there is a way to be like, okay, cost per square foot, if it's like 100 square foot offices with simple lighting controls needs, okay, maybe you can punt it. But when you get to the more complex stuff, it's like the square footage doesn't affect the system anymore. Your system
No,
is still super complex.
absolutely. Especially with some of like the sports, like the stadiums and stuff like that are
Mhm.
going on right now. So
Right.
it's definitely a different conversation when you're looking at a higher tier architecture. But I mean,
Right.
that's one of the situations too, is having somebody that knows their product and knows what
Mhm.
aspects of the company that they can leverage for those different areas, right? We have a solution for the switch and the light fixture. We don't even need wires in between there. You're controlling it over the power lines that are in the wall.
Right.
It's a push button architecture, and there you go. There's nothing to that, right? Like everybody can do that, but then you run into a touchscreen that controls the entirety of the building, or something that's behind the scenes that's talking to the BMS, and maybe the BMS is running it, and that's a completely different setup. But
Right.
yeah,
No, totally. And so, trying to put on my Ron hat while he's out today, I imagine he would start asking about like the labor on site and the programming and how do you estimate for that? Because
yeah,
again, the super simple push button, you don't need to program that. It's already ready to go out of the box. But with the super complex stuff for stadiums, you've got to consider what is your manufacturer's technician going to need to do on site.
yeah, and that's stuff that you can't figure out at SD, just because of the fact that you don't know that it's going to be there, and maybe it's still there through DD, and then in CDs it disappears because somebody realized, oh, this is way over budget, and we need to
Right.
bring it back to earth. Um, Yeah, no, and so making that, but then at that point, maybe you've budgeted for all of that because of a conversation you had in the beginning, and by the time it gets to that DD, somebody says, "Listen, I can get this a lot cheaper from this other guy over here." So that's when that becomes a problem, right? Like
Right.
that's when your relationship with the channels is definitely the most important thing you could have.
Mhm. And so, going back to that in SD, you said that it's really hard to estimate for that labor. Are there things that designers can keep in mind for that purpose so that if you get pulled onto a project in SD, what are the questions that you're going to ask so that you can answer the question, what is the labor going to be for this project?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of going to come into play when we're talking, like we can kind of culminate that into the other conversations that we've had and say, are we designing just to code compliance here, or are we doing other things? And I think every time I ask the question, how does the end user want this space controlled?
Mm.
No, I don't think I've ever gotten an answer from that in like an early design meeting, which
Sure.
which is, there's nothing wrong with that because the questions haven't been asked yet. But uh, you know, something to keep in mind is maybe, ask your rep, ask your partner, whoever you're working with in the channel, what do we think is going to be needed for time as far as commissioning, if we just went with code compliance, or if we go with something more. Do you know what's included in the package that you're buying? Because a lot of the times, it does get a lot. I feel like it gets put together. The commissioning gets priced with the actual package, and
Hmm.
being able to understand the fact that there is time built in, or maybe in some instances, I don't know how other reps are handling that, but if it's not included, if they give you a set amount of days or something like that, just make sure that, maybe, and keep asking throughout the design process, hey, are we still on track with like what you're thinking for commissioning, and what's going on there? I think that just keeping in communication, right? And I know,
Hmm.
again, broken record, but it's, communications. The biggest thing that we can do is keeping everybody on the same page, and holding the same expectations throughout the entirety of the project. Um,
Well, and
I
I
don't
can
think
get
there's a
behind.
blanket question you could ask. I mean, what would you have asked? You were a designer. What would you have asked? What was the
Well, no,
questions that you have in mind?
you're absolutely right. I mean, it is all about what does the end user want when they walk into the space? What does the end
Right.
user want when they go over to the touch screen and push buttons? What are they expecting? And so, having those conversations early on in SD can actually help shape the rest of the project going forward. So, sometimes people have a really potent idea of what they want for their lighting controls, and sometimes they have no idea what even to think about when it comes to lighting controls. But
Can
if
you
you can at
introduce me
least,
to that first group?
yeah, I'd like to meet that first group too. No, in all seriousness, I mean it really runs the gamut. But the majority of people that I've met who have that like clear idea of what they want, they're
Yeah,
usually a professional of some kind when it comes to their space. So, for instance, somebody involved in theater, they're going to know what they want because
absolutely.
they use it every single day, and they know the frustrations of what they currently have. They know how to improve it, and so they've got a palpable idea of what they want to do on top of what they currently have, or just to replace what they currently have. When it comes to the people who are on the opposite end, it's usually somebody who is a professional outside of the space, or like a CEO or something, somebody who walks through the spaces but doesn't really think about using the spaces in the way that the occupants would normally use it. And so sometimes you need to drill further down past, the first person that you talk to who is ownership representation, and keep asking questions. But I think you're right. The more you talk, the better you're suited to be able to answer these questions and design the system. And so I hear a lot of specifiers, poking me saying, "Well, but we don't have the fee for that." And it's like, yeah, you're right. It still doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing it. Like, you don't have the fee, but you should still communicate. And so I think that's the other issue that we're running into in the industry right now, is there's just not fee for lighting controls design as it should be. We're seeing more that the scope is, like you said, a gray territory. We don't know who's doing it, who owns it, and so that's why the rep ends up taking it, like you said, because the rep is the catch-all.
Hmm.
They're representing the product, and the product needs to stand on its own. And so, okay, fine, the rep is going to be the one to take on the responsibility if there's no design.
And when you were going through that, you just reminded me of another example where, it ended up, I worked on a project in design and we designed a control system for it. And the end user ended up not going with the control system that we provided. They ended up VEing, which there's rarely any value and there's never any engineering. Uh, but they ended up being and going through that process and getting to a point where they had a bank of switches on the wall that were from Home Depot. They were controlling some high bay fixtures, and we ended up. I hadn't been to the space in a while. I ended up going there for an event that we were hosting there. Ended up meeting by chance one of the employee number 3 or something like that, and he was giving us a tour of the space. And we got to the control station, and at that point he knew I worked with lighting and controls, so he got to kind of sound off a little bit, and he told me how much he hated just having that bank of switches, and I said, that's not what it was supposed to be. It was supposed to go a different way, and now they're designing a new space, and I actually got brought in with the end users on that project, and it went from some other comments came up about how the space felt at certain times during the day and everything like that. But we had that holistic conversation. This was probably in a DD or an early CD stage where we got involved with the end user, but it was great. It was refreshing, and
Mhm.
it just so happened that the end user actually had engineering background. So again, he's a professional in his space, but at the same time, he had understanding of the electrical space, so it helped
Mhm.
out. But yeah, now we have a whole warm glow dimming system in their new space, and
Nice.
it's going to be really cool. Can't wait for it to open.
Well, cool. Well, I'm
Yeah,
just going to encapsulate what we talked about here today,
yeah,
because this is something that Ron and I beat on our drum all the time, which is, clarify who's responsible for lighting controls, clarify what the intent is, have those conversations, keep talking, keep the ball moving, keep getting people involved earlier and earlier if you can. But I mean, from your perspective, you're a specification sales rep, so you represent a manufacturer. You have a responsibility to make sure that if your product is used on a project, that people are going to be satisfied with the results, whatever that means. And granted, there's definitely a limit. I mean, you can't just like write $1 million check and be like, okay, Acuity's going to pick it up. But there is a level of responsibility, and that's why the sales rep ends up becoming this catch-all for missed scope or missed work, because that nobody else is taking ownership of it, and we end up with a finger pointing game, and like you said, nobody likes playing that game. And so it's just easier to be like, okay, we're going to take care of it, don't worry about it, let's move on with our lives. But as far as what designers can do, they can reach out to you early on in the process and at least give you as much information as they can. They don't have to have all the answers right away, but
Right.
at the very least, you can start asking them questions that maybe they didn't think about asking, or maybe, they didn't even think about it. And so ultimately, you're going to be a part of that team. You're not a fee paid person, you're a commission paid person. And so they don't have to pay you, but ultimately the work you're doing, you will get paid if your product is used on the project, and that's your incentive. But at the same time, you're still a member of the team. You still want the project to be a success. And so that's really where sales reps are right now when it comes to lighting controls. And the better we can improve our communication, the better we can improve our documentation, and the more we can have these conversations about what people want for their spaces, the better our solutions can be in the end, and the happier people can be with lighting controls.
Yeah, and that's the goal, right? Like I love walking back into a space to check in with an owner, a couple months after construction's done and they've lived there. We get calls back all the time just because they want to change, they want to tweak programming, and they've lived in the space. It's once somebody, when you have those conversations and then you live in that space for a little bit, there's going to be flexibility that you understand. So it's definitely the goal is just an end user's satisfaction. And,
Yeah.
Obviously engineering and architecturally and lighting designer satisfaction as well. But I feel like it's easier, like that's probably the level of how you have to please those people too, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the
Yeah.
chain. So it's, it definitely, it's as a rep, it's one of those things that you just have to learn, and you have to like kind of encompass, and you have to be ready to take on a project and go from there.
No,
Yeah.
totally. Well, Anthony, thank you so much for joining me here today. I think this was a really cool conversation.
Thank you for having me. It was definitely cool for my first podcast. So,
Well, hopefully not the last one. But everyone else joining us here today, thank you so much. Just want to remind you that this podcast is presented by the Lighting Controls Association, or LCA, and it's financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, or NAILD. And again, check out our website. We've got all of our episodes on there. We've got a news feed for the industry when it comes to lighting controls, and we've got a merch store if you want to buy something and support the podcast. But until we see you next time, thank you so much for joining us. And Anthony, again, thank you so much. This was a really awesome conversation.